there, and welcome to the Hope It Helps podcast. Derek Evans here, your host. This is, of course, where we together find the calm in the everyday chaos of life. I decided to just go ahead and shoot some video today instead of just doing the podcast. I'm at the studio, at my office in the studio. Just got finished prepping for the TV show shoot tomorrow, so feeling pretty good about that. And wanted to, and hey, take a look. Office is not kind of your normal office. We have things are pretty neat here, and I've got a cool link I'll share with you eventually to take a tour of this thing if you want to. But for my office, I didn't want anything. I just didn't want walls. I wanted something cool. So that's actually Petco Park where the Padres play baseball behind me. Today I want to talk about suffering, and not the type of suffering that is what we would call real suffering, meaning starving children in Africa. Okay, people who are who have medical issues and they have no way to get attention. That type of suffering, that's real suffering. There's two kinds. There's real suffering, and then there's mental suffering. And I'm not talking about people who have mental disorders either. I'm talking about people just like you, just like me, everyday people who have and experience mental suffering. So real suffering obviously is not good, but mental suffering is something that's self-inflicted. And there are a number of different ways that we can avoid mental suffering. And what's funny is that actual suffering can help us avoid mental suffering. And I'll explain that in detail today. So there's several things you can do that you can practice that will help you stop suffering. Yoga, meditation, mindfulness. These are all things that help stop mental suffering when we kind of get in our own way, when we get in our own heads. Actual suffering can do the same. So if we look at the spectrum, let's think about the spectrum of, all the way to one side, real suffering. Starving children in Africa is this side. There are children who are actually starving to death right now. That's real suffering. And go all the way over to this side, and we have our 6-year-old son or daughter who's throwing a tantrum, screaming at the top of their lungs because we won't buy them the toy that they want in Target. Okay? So that's the full range of suffering, from real suffering to not real suffering, but yet suffering nonetheless. And I think that's important to understand, because although we can say things aren't real, things are illusions. If they cause us to suffer mentally, then they have real life implications. In other words, someone who's perfectly beautiful might think that they're ugly. And because of that, they may have a negative attitude, or they may have negative ripples that they spread throughout the day. Whereas if they understood the reality, that wouldn't be the case. But those negative ripples are real. So that feeling, and ultimately what it projects from them throughout their day, is very, very real. So how do we use actual suffering to help tame mental suffering? If you study a lot of ancient wisdom traditions, Buddhism, Falun Gong, there are a lot of different, even Christianity, Islam, all of these spiritual traditions talk about being humble, talk about suffering, resist not evil as an example. To suffer is to get in touch with your soul. And that's kind of what the goal is of all spiritual journeys, right? Is to get in touch with your soul. When we experience suffering, it actually allows us to get to the core of what we really feel and what we really believe, or to our soul. You notice that. Think about the last time that you really, really suffered. And I mean true suffering, not just mental suffering, but actual suffering. Maybe you lost a job, lost a family member, things like that. Think about that, and what happened to your perspective when you experienced that suffering? Did you all of a sudden take all those little things that we tend to give so much value to and just kind of push those to the side and go, you know what? This doesn't really matter. Sports, people I'm trying to date or whatever, none of this stuff really matters. People who like me don't like me, career. You kind of looked at all those things and said, gosh, none of this stuff matters. What really matters And what happens there is that when we suffer, the ego sort of gets cut out of the equation. Because in true suffering, there's no room for the ego. The ego can be bruised, and it can most certainly impact what you're doing. But if you experience real suffering, not mental suffering, real suffering, the ego kind of goes away. And it's a really interesting phenomenon. So this is how we can use real suffering. And I say suffering, and I mean very lightly, okay? Remember, starving children in Africa suffering, 6-year-old tantrum because they can't get a toy suffering. The suffering we're talking about is much closer to here than it is to here. But a lot of people would see it as real suffering. Here's an example. You go to a restaurant, you order some food, and they bring it to you and it's not exactly what you want. Maybe you don't like avocado, they put avocado in it. Maybe you don't like onions, they put onions in it. Or maybe they brought you the wrong dish altogether. What we try to do is we so desperately run away from suffering that we cause ourselves suffering. In a situation like that, someone would become upset and go, oh gosh, this always happens to me. They always screw up my order. Oh, I'm having such a bad day. Just eat the food. That's the suffering I'm talking about. If we can just say, I'm so grateful to have this food, and I know I've paid for it. I should get what I want. But it's okay. I'm not going to waste this food. This food, which is the gift of life. I'm not going to waste that. I'm just going to go ahead and eat that. And I'm going to suffer through it. Maybe it's full of anchovies and I hate anchovies. I'm going to go ahead and eat it anyway. Now, that's not real suffering. It's not. But how many of us would do that if it weren't for consciousness and awareness? That's a really good question. So if we can just look for opportunities like that to suffer, what we'll find is that it connects us closer to our soul, to our true self, our higher self, if you will. Because of the fact that it automatically sets the ego aside, especially if you accept the suffering. Because a lot of times it's the ego that is the problem. When you receive that food at the restaurant, this is just our example that we're running with, if you receive that food, you feel offended. Oh my gosh, how could they not get my order right? Did you hear me tell him no anchovies? I said no anchovies. Did he not hear me? Did he care so little about me he didn't write down what I said? It's all ego-based. And I've seen people nicely send stuff back. But the suffering aspect is to go ahead and take it. Or let's say you get off on the wrong exit. Just go the long way. It's okay. Suffer through that extra 3 minutes that it takes. Whenever you have an opportunity like that, let's say you're sitting in a seat and it's not your desired seat at the movie theater, but it's full. The theater's full. 2 people get up and walk out from perfect seats in the middle. Remain in your seat. That is the suffering I'm referring to when I say suffering is good, because it helps us balance this. If we can suffer between starving child in Africa, that's real suffering. That's not good. 6-year-old tantrum in Target because they can't get the toy. In order to get here, which is where you really want to be, you have to go this direction. So you have to suffer some. It's important to do it. If you find yourself not suffering through anything, let's say the shower is not the temperature you want, you're out of hot water. Take that cold shower or lukewarm shower, whatever it is, be grateful for it. So it does kind of circle back around to gratitude. It does kind of circle back around to self-referral, which is a big part of our meditation practice. Our Sunday meditation practice is all about self-referral. It does kind of come all the way back to those things. But we so refuse to suffer that we don't allow ourselves that connection with the soul. We're constantly placating the ego and its desire not to suffer. Because you and I, we don't really suffer. We don't. We're not starving. We don't have diseases that we can't be treated for. We don't experience real suffering. But we can experience suffering from our perspective in order to get closer to the soul. And I really, really hope that helps. Thanks for hanging out with me for this edition of the Hope It Helps podcast in my office here at this TV studio. I appreciate you listening and your comments and the direct messages. I always enjoy interacting with you, and I appreciate your questions too. We have a lot of fun. I chat with people all the time, especially on the weekends, who have questions about these podcasts. I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Namaste.